It is a tremendous pleasure to be here. Moby-Dick is my personal Bible, and not being an academic, I miss the camaraderie of being with fellow intellectuals. And so this symposium idea is just so much fun for me, and it's just been great to hear tough acts to follow. And, but just wonderful. And I remember years ago, I think the first academic conference I ever attended was here on Nantucket when Susan Beagle and Wes Tiffany, who used to be at the UMass Field Station, organized a Steinbeck and the Environment conference. And I delivered a paper on Steinbeck's last novel, The Winter of Our Discontent. By that time, Steinbeck, we all associate him with California and Grapes of Wrath, had settled in Sag Harbor, a whaling port, old whaling port in Long Island. And The Winter of Discontent is about that town meeting the challenges of development of a historic town, dealing with all that. And it just resonated. And I got into Steinbeck's connection to Moby-Dick. Steinbeck was on Nantucket in 1951 for the centennial celebration of Moby-Dick. He wrote to his editor, "I have never been in a place with so much energy." He would write a significant portion of East of Eden while out at Sankaty. He was good friends with the Benchleys, and all this kind of thing. And so, so when he was back in Sag Harbor, he was the honorary chair of the annual Old Whalers Festival, which included a floating Moby-Dick powered by motor known as Mobile-Dick. So, I mean, it just keeps on going. And we've been talking about Moby-Dick's, incredible ability to seem increasingly relevant as we move farther and farther away from the circumstances under which it was created. And I mean, this is the year, it's Melville's 200th, and I was privileged to speak before a marathon reading, because the marathons of Moby-Dick are sprouting up everywhere. And there was one in January at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And Newberry is always, if you're into Moby-Dick, it's the Northwestern Newberry editions that are the editions. And it was fantastic to be out there. It's a library that is also a museum, and they had a exhibit of the Rockwell Kent Lakeside editions. And just as a personal thing, my father is now, he's 90 and living on the Cape. Used to teach summers at Mystic. He was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. That's why I grew up in that maritime center of the universe. And Moby-Dick was his favorite book. And when I was growing up, I hated Moby-Dick because my father thought it was the greatest book. And I was a teenager in the 60s. And he would rap eloquently at dinner about it. The battle-scarred novel was on his desk, and I just thought it was the stupidest thing ever. And then I was in an AP English class as a senior, and Mr. Wells told us we had to read Moby-Dick if we were going to graduate. And it's when I experienced the worst thing a teenager can experience, to be proven that your father was right. Because I started reading Moby-Dick. And I had by that point developed an improbable interest in sailing. I was beginning to race sunfish sailboats, of all things. I had actually participated in the Sunfish World Championship in Martinique the previous winter. I was the youngest contestant. I was 16 years old. I mean, the women were topless. It was just incredible. But once I was at this big inner city high school in Pittsburgh, I was anonymous. And so I'm reading the first chapter of Moby-Dick, Call Me Ishmael. And what he describes, the island of New York, Manhattan, on a Sunday, in which all of these people who spend their days pent up in lath and plaster make their way to the Battery to look out on the harbor and the ocean beyond. And what are they in search of? the ungraspable phantom of life. Oh my God, this was the best friend I had never met. This was Ishmael. And I was not hooked, I was harpooned. And I know I was the only one of my classmates to really appreciate the fact that I read Moby-Dick, but it just had a lasting impact on me. And what's interesting is the Rockwell Kent, those are iconic illustrations. And interestingly, my father in the last few years has written the introductions to the Lakeside editions of classics. This may be the last year of the Lakeside editions, because the Donnelly Press, which, by the way, printed In the Heart of the Sea, and I had a old college friend who worked there, but they don't allow authors at the press, so we made the pretend, and so we couldn't tell my editor that I was going, because the last thing they want is an author seeing the book come out and say, whoa, you got to change something. So they snuck me in, and I watched. And this was in West Virginia, a huge printing plant. I watched as the first In the Heart of the Sea came out. It was just an amazing experience, and just gave me a visceral sense of the Rockwell Kent stuff, the making of that book. Oh my gosh, and the continued relevance of it. Melville writes Moby-Dick, and it falls on completely deaf ears. It's not really until after World War I. When society had to go through that incredible collective trauma, that the world began to catch up with Melville's vision of the universe. And people began to read the book, and it began to resonate in ways that Melville could never have anticipated. But one of his biggest early fans was William Faulkner, who claimed that of books written by other authors, it was the one book he wished he had written. And I was on book tour in Oxford, Mississippi, and got the opportunity to go to Faulkner's home, and it's as if they locked it after he died, and it's just the way it was. His bourbon bottle is still on the refrigerator, and there in the living room is Rockwell Kent's Ahab. Bam! I mean, that's it. That's the power of Melville. And Mary Kay, I have to say, I owe so much to Mary Kay. When I was working on In the Heart of the Sea, I had to go down to Mystic Seaport. And so I remember we spent quite a long afternoon, maybe a little longer than that, where Mary was just explaining to me how this all worked. Being on a whaleboat, rowing, throwing the harpoon, it was absolutely essential. And spending time up in the forecastle, trying to visualize what it was like when a whale, because I was writing about the Essex, the Nantucket whale ship that got rammed by a whale, what was it like when a creature as large as an 85-foot, 85-ton sperm whale crashed into the bow? And so that was just amazing. And then fast forward about 12 years, where In the Heart of the Sea looks like it's going to become a movie. By that time, the Charles W. Morgan is being restored to her former glory, and I had the opportunity to have lunch in the captain's cabin with Ron Howard and the screenwriter Peter Morgan of The Queen and The Crown and all that. He was rewriting some of the script, and it was like, oh my, wow, what's this going? And what was fascinating in talking with Ron Howard, who had been introduced to my book through a screenplay, then read the book, and was just trying to reconcile things. What he said he wanted to do visually was to quote Moby-Dick. And so if you watch In the Heart of the Sea, and I think it's going to be, you can watch it at the Dreamland, if not today, it's at some point, he's doing it. And it's subtle, it's interesting, but once again, the power. And my father, the retired academic, said, Moby-Dick has inspired so many. It's kind of nice that the story of the Essex is being re-inspired by Moby-Dick. It's just the continued power of all of that. And so, and then Mary Kay was talking about how incredible that voyage was. I was actually on the Charles W. Morgan when you guys were in the whaleboat rowing around this. We were off Provincetown, and it was just incredible. We were surrounded by whales leaping into the air, and I was so envious of you guys in the whaleboat, you know, just up there. And at one point, my enthusiasm, you know, it was just like my brains were dribbling out of my ears as I'm watching this, and there was a harpoon right near the whale, and I felt myself like grabbing it. I thought, no, you know, the story's crazed historian arrested for trying to harpoon a whale. But once again, the continued power of this story to reinvent. And I have to say, you know, I wrote my book, Why Read Moby-Dick, back in 2011. So that's, what, now 8 years ago. And when I wrote it, there were things like the oil spill down in the Gulf. People were reacting to that in terms of Moby-Dick. Things were going on with Gaddafi. You know, all of that. You know, it was just becoming newly relevant, and it was, you know, popping all around. And then I went on to write 3 books about the Revolution. And one of them is called Valiant Ambition, which pairs George Washington with Benedict Arnold. And I was, you know, reading about Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was a great hero before he turned traitor. And I'm trying to get a handle on, he was badly injured at the Battle of Saratoga. One of his legs was basically shot off. And the surgeons wanted to amputate it. He refused. He would be in a hospital bed for 3-4 months, bone spurs weeping through the wound. They realized they had to reset it again after all that. Eventually, he would, when he emerged from the sick bed, his leg would be 2 inches shorter than the other one, and it began a downward spiral in which he would get increasingly disenchanted with the American cause. Why am I doing this? If, you know, all of this going on, and I began, you know, I kept saying, wow, Moby-Dick, Ahab, and then I began to realize, wait a minute, Melville's grandfather was Peter Gansevoort. Who was a great hero during the Revolution and in command of Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk River. Guess who saved Peter Gansevoort from what looked like imminent surrender to the British and a large native component that would probably, they were convinced, would lead to a massacre? It was Benedict Arnold, who before the Battle of Saratoga would lead a lightning strike up the Mohawk, intimidate the British that the native forces abandoned them, and they had to give it up. And so Peter Gansevoort survived and became the great hero. His uniform, I think, is at the Smithsonian, and Melville was very aware of this. He, unfortunately for his son, he named him Stanwix for Fort Stanwix. And so this was something absolutely embedded in Melville. And then I began to read the chapters about Ahab after the injury and what goes on, where he goes insane. He cannot be contained. They lash him to his bunk, and as they're going around the horn, he's screaming, and you know and he emerges from that a changed man, someone not visibly insane, but truly insane. And I began to think about, well, what happened to Arnold? It was very similar. And there's even a reference to specific reference to Arnold in Moby-Dick, where the whales they come across this huge pod of whales in the Armada chapter, and one of the whales gets a spade attached to his tail, and he's going through this pod, and the spade is slashing other whales and maddening them into this great frenzy. And he compares that to Arnold on the battlefield at Saratoga, where he went kind of insane, went out there and was just a whirling dervish on the battlefield and actually turned the battle around for the Americans. And so, this is something for me that's been, I can't believe as I move along, it continues to be relevant. And how did he do it? What happened? How did Melville create something that seems to just become more and more relevant the farther we get from those circumstances? Well, it's in the summer of 1850, he had pretty much come close to finishing, it seems to be, a kind of conventional novel about whaling. He had, as Mary Kay was talking about, he had done Red Burn and White Jacket. They're not rollicking necessarily, but they're of a they're of a tone, and they're for them. He wrote them tremendously quickly, just pumped them out, and so he seems to have hit upon a kind of lighthearted, conventional whaling narrative, and then he decides to take the family to the Berkshires from New York, and he meets none other than Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne had just published The Scarlet Letter. I mean, this is, for me, just think, The Scarlet Letter. He's just published The Scarlet Letter. It's selling well. And hi, Nathaniel. And so Melville meets Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it's interesting, there's some evidence that Hawthorne was a very shy man and not the outgoing sort of impulsive sort like Melville. And there's some evidence that he had sort of instructed his wife to try to make it so that he didn't have to meet Melville, but they did meet, and they actually spent some time during a shower of rain and during a literary picnic, and it clearly ignited something in Melville. He would then write an anonymous review, not of The Scarlet Letter, but of an earlier group of short stories, Mosses from an Old Manse, that, and it's anonymous, but it's a love letter to Hawthorne. And what is interesting is you can see his creative process beginning. What he's locking onto is, he says, we think of Hawthorne as this, writing these perfectly distilled, crystalline short stories about our colonial past. But no, there's so much more in Hawthorne. There is the power of blackness. This is what attracts Melville, and it's that ability to dive down deep into places that we can't even admit exist, because otherwise we'd just lose it all and go insane. And that he uses that to translate into Shakespeare and about all of those figures and how Shakespeare. Why do we read Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare took. He's taking stories about kings from an earlier era and really writing about Elizabethan England when he's doing it. And it's that, his ability to bring his own time to life through another, that gives them, those gaps create the ability for it to work beyond his own time. And that's what you see exactly happening with Melville at this summer. It's just beginning to percolate. And he's reading, as Mary Kay was talking about, he's reading Shakespeare, it's Milton, it's the King James Bible, it's in him. It's it's as much a part of him as anything he's reading in the newspaper. And what is he reading in the newspaper? Well, this is 1850, and things are happening in America. There has been the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's impossible to overstate the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act. The country, slavery has been the lie festering at the heart of America ever since the Constitutional Convention. And it's been a line people have been teetering on for a long time, but with the Fugitive Slave Act, it means that any slave who escapes from the South and into the North, the Northerners are legally bound to return that person. No longer can the Northerners say it's a Southern problem. Now it is a national problem. And things are, and there's a mention of Melville's father-in-law, Justice Shaw. Justice Shaw would hear one of the first cases relating to the Fugitive Slave Act. Shaw hated slavery, but it was his job to uphold the laws of this land. He would be, vilified in the press. He saw on, he came on the side of the slaveholders, and there was a riot in Boston. This is going on in that fall when this is what's going on. He's in the midst of a country on the edge of a catastrophe. It's there, it's everywhere. And I think that, as much as meeting Hawthorne, he just takes that conventional novel about whaling and begins to rip it apart. I think you see the foundations of that conventional novel in the beginning of Moby-Dick. It begins as a wonderful buddy flick with Ishmael and Queequeg. It's great. It's just the tone, it's funny, the jokes. It's, Johnny Carson has nothing on Melville when it comes to, with the Quaker ship owner calling Queequeg quahog. It's just great. But it's in this titanic psychic maelstrom that Melville creates Ahab. This is the great gift Hawthorne gave Melville. And Ahab is as much a thing of the Fugitive Slave Act and slavery and what is happening to society as it is anything. And Melville quite impulsively says to his wife, I want to be near Hawthorne. We're going to move to the Berkshires. Can you imagine this? He's got a kid that Malcolm Stanwyck, poorly named Stanwyck, will be out on the way soon. He moves his family to the Berkshires. They buy a house with loans from friends and family. He can't support this. There are very few writers at this time who can support themselves. Dickens and a few others are about it. And he's basing this on a novel, that he's completely reconceived about whaling. So they move out to Arrowhead in the Berkshires. And it's one of the great literary historical museums. You can go up to his office and look out and see Mount Greylock. And he begins writing, and his letters are wonderful at this time. He describes, he looks out, there's snow across the fields, and it gives him a sea feeling. He's in it. He's just descends into it. And so he's torn this novel apart, and he just starts, it's like someone taking a old Quaker mansion, tearing it apart and getting an architect like Gary to start, doing new gables and things that don't fit. It's experimental. He's just creating this thing that is much driven by his own psyche as it is the material. And he's working feverishly. He starts in the morning. His family members are instructed to leave his food outside his door, his locked door. Sometimes it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon before he opens that door. He's working in his subsequent novel, Pierre, which is very autobiographical. He basically describes the process under which he was writing Moby-Dick, where he's working so intensely. He already had weak eyes. It seems to have been a function of his years out there in the South Pacific. But his eyes begin to hurt him so much that he can barely open them, and it may have been some kind of infection or something like that. And so he's having to he's barely able to even see the page as he's just writing this stuff. And then in the evening he's down with his family members, and what he describes in a letter, I think, to Hawthorne, in a mesmeric state. He's in it. He's totally in it. And he creates Moby-Dick. And so, in it is not just, his source material. And he was reading voluminously. He's reading all this stuff, and it's not just the classics. He's reading natural history. He's stealing too. I mean, he's just, he's like Picasso. It's not an influence. You just steal a hunk of it and then riff with it. I mean, that's what he's doing. Man, it's just all pieces, and it's all coming at him. And he's off and running. And finally, by the summer of 1851, it's going to the press. He's down in New York, just pushing himself to do the final 3 chapters, with Moby-Dick attacking the whale. It's the best action writing ever written. I mean, he's just in his own. I think Bob Dylan, in his 20s, when he was just, if in interviews he says, I don't quite know how I did it then. It was like he was channeling something. Melville was doing that. It was just coming through him in this, incredible torrent. And so, finally the book is published, and it's lost. There's no reader about it. I mean, what could they make of this thing? This is a guy, who's created a 20th, if not 21st century experimental novel, and it's about, it's already outdated. Whaling, yes, will go on, but it's now, the sea used to be America's frontier, but by this time they've discovered gold. It's the West everybody's interested in. And so those are the stories people are devouring. Whaling, so it falls on deaf ears and then is rediscovered in the 20th century. And so, one of the things this actually last night, I was thinking, okay, let me return to Moby-Dick. And how is it resonating with me now? And I'd like to, let's see, I hope this, I'm going to read a portion, if not the full chapter. Remember, this was written in 2010, so a long time ago. I'm going to read a chapter from Why Read Moby-Dick. Is that all right? Okay. The chapter title is Anatomy of a Demagogue. To be in the presence of a great leader is to know a blighted soul who has managed to make the darkness work for him. Ishmael says it best, for all men tragically great are made so through a certain morbidness. Be sure of this, O young ambition. All mortal greatness is but disease. In chapter 36, The Quarterdeck, Melville shows us how susceptible we ordinary people are to the seductive power of a great and demented man. At the beginning of the chapter, Ahab sees with barely contained energy as he paces back and forth across the deck, the point of his whalebone leg leaving the wood dented like geological stones. Stubb, the second mate, observes that the chick that's in him pecks the shell. And then it begins, Ahab's version of a command performance. Until this point, he has not revealed the secret purpose of the voyage. What he wants to do is illegal. He has not been hired by the Pequod's owners to revenge himself on a white whale. However, if he can win the crew and his pliable second and third mates to his purpose, perhaps he can bulldoze the first mate Starbuck into accepting the inevitable. He orders Starbuck to send everybody aft. Once the crew has been gathered before him, he continues to pace back and forth. Only after their curiosity has been suitably aroused does he begin by asking an unexpected question. What do ye do when ye see a whale, men? Sing out for him, is the immediate reply. For a demagogue, it's the oldest trick in the book. With each question and response, the crowd cannot help but be wooed to the speaker's enthusiastic purpose. Mariners began to gaze curiously at each other, Ishmael relates, as if marveling how it was that they themselves became so excited at such seemingly purposeless questions. This is the dynamic of the political rally, the kind of rhetorically fueled gathering that Melville's older brother Gansevoort, a low-level Democratic Party operative, helped organize during his abbreviated political career. It's also the dynamic of the revival meetings of the Second Great Awakening, which swept across America during the first half of the 19th century and which contributed in turn to the growing evangelical fervor of the abolitionist movement in the years prior to the Civil War. Now that Ahab has the ship's crew in his power, he brings out a prop, a gold doubloon. He then orders Starbuck to give him a hammer, and as he prepares to nail the coin to the mast, he tells them that the first person to see a white whale with a wrinkled brow and a crooked jaw will get the coin. The crowd goes wild. Huzzah, huzzah, cried the seamen, as with swinging tarpaulins they hailed the act of nailing the gold to the mast. And then it goes on a little bit. And then finally, Starbuck begins to question, is the only one who's not yet under the spell, and begins to question Ahab about all of this. He asks, what will Ahab's vengeance get in our Nantucket market? It's then, to borrow from my favorite movie, This Is Spinal Tap, that Ahab dials his charisma to 11. But come closer, Starbuck, he says. Thou requirest a little lower layer. It's not about the money, he explains. This is personal. Thumping his chest, he cries out, my vengeance will fetch a great premium here. Starbuck is quite rightly appalled. To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, he sputters, seems blasphemous. This prompts Ahab to reveal the logic, such as it is, behind his campaign against the white whale. According to Ahab, Moby-Dick is not just a sperm whale, he is the tool of an unseen and decidedly evil purpose, evil power. All visible objects, Ahab insists, are but as pasteboard masks. By killing Moby-Dick, he will punch through the mask and get at the root cause of all his unhappiness and pain. He then compares the world to a jail cell. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Unlocking the secrets of the universe by killing a whale doesn't make much sense. But what good is rationality to a man possessed by such terrifying and all-devouring rage? He tasks me, he heaps me, Ahab cries. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. There. And finally, as we approach the end of this hour, I want to just return to Melville, because he publishes Moby-Dick. It does not go well. He then writes Pierre, an incredible novel, but it's one in which he brings out all the embarrassing skeletons in his family's closet. I mean, it's just, anyways. And then that summer, the summer after publishing Moby-Dick, he goes on a road trip with his father-in-law, Justice Shaw. So this is not even a year after the Fugitive Slave Act. And where do they go? They go to the island of Nantucket, along with I think the Vineyard and the Cape. He's the justice that moves along. And can you imagine it? Melville coming to Nantucket less than a year after the publication of Moby-Dick. I mean, it's just, you really cannot make this stuff up. He stays at the Jared Coffin House. Captain Pollard, captain of the Essex, is in the house basically next door. And in Melville's copy of Owen Chase, the first mate of the Essex, of his account of the Essex disaster, Melville late in life would write in green crayon, because now his eyes that were already giving him problems are really giving him problems. And I'm paraphrasing here. Sometime in the 1850s, went to the island of Nantucket, met Captain Pollard, who by this time not only lost the Essex, but his next command, the two brothers, the next year. Met Captain Pollard. To the islanders, a nobody, but to me, the most remarkable man I have ever met. What he saw in Pollard, I think, was a role model for how he would conduct himself for the rest of his life. Because, with Moby-Dick, he had gone through one of the great personal and professional disappointments, he could experience. He would continue. Pollard by this time was a night watchman. It wasn't as if he refused to even think of the Essex. Every November 20th, he would lock himself in his room and fast in memory of those who had died on the Essex. You know, he didn't pretend it never happened, but he led a productive life. Melville would do the same, but it's poignant. He misses Hawthorne. Hawthorne by this time has left the Berkshires. I don't think he could handle the intensity of his relationship with Melville. He's back in, I think, the Concord area. And Melville, during this tour, hears the story of Agatha, a woman who marries a seaman, has his child. The sailor sails off and does not return for 17 years. Melville hears this story and writes a letter to Hawthorne saying, I heard this story. This is your kind of story. You should write it. It's a pathetic story. It's a letter. It's the Agatha letters, they're known as. And he sets the scene on Sankaty Light here on Nantucket. She lives, she's the daughter of a lighthouse keeper, describes the erosion, already, which is just, anyways. And he even goes to Hawthorne's place in Concord, and they have a meeting. Hawthorne says, no, Herman, you write this. He would write a novel with the title The Isle of the Cross. It's been lost. It maybe have been burned. There's some mention that he mentioned that he was prevented of publishing it. It might have been a fear of a lawsuit because this person was still alive. Who knows? But it was yet another great disappointment. Melville then, he continues to write incredible short stories, but it's not going well. His family pays for a trip to the Holy Land. On the way, he meets Hawthorne, who is then working in the consulate in Liverpool. They have a meeting on the sands of Liverpool. Hawthorne says, Melville is still Melville. He is the most religious man I've ever met, but he cannot yet comfort himself in belief. He's wandering. He compares him to wandering these sand shores. And then finally, Melville returns to New York, has to work for 20 years in the customs house, a place rife with bribery. I mean, he was known as the only honest man working at the customs house. Humiliating place to be. Finally, some deaths in the family, they get a small inheritance and he can retire, but he continues to write and dies with the great novella, Billy Budd, on his desk. And it was after he died that he had this, and I will end with reading the end of Why Read Moby-Dick. He had this little writing desk. It was a portable thing, and it was open in the bottom, which you could see him lying down in bed and working away. And it was later found that inside was a little piece of paper pasted in there with a motto written on it. And it read, "Keep true to the dreams of thy youth." The phrase comes from the German playwright and poet Friedrich Schiller. But what was its relevance to Melville? Keep true to the dreams of thy youth. Late in life, he wrote to his father-in-law, "At my years and with my disposition, or rather constitution, one gets to care less and less for everything except downright good feeling. Life is so short and ridiculous and irrational from a certain point of view that one knows not what to make of it unless, well, finish the sentence for yourself." I propose that Melville would have finished that sentence with the words taped inside his writing desk. Keep true to the dreams of thy youth. In the end, Melville had found a way back to the view espoused by Ishmael in Moby-Dick. Doubts of all things earthly and intuitions of some things heavenly, this combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards them both with equal eye. This redemptive mixture of skepticism and hope, this genial stoicism in the face of a short, ridiculous, and irrational life, is why I read Moby-Dick. Thank you very much.